A broken man bought a desperate woman and her two small shadows, not for possession, but from a silence that screamed louder than any auctioneer's gavel, until he realized he wasn't just offering shelter, he was rebuilding a world. The sun, a merciless eye in the bleached sky, beat down on Redemption Gulch, a name spat out more than spoken, a place where hope came to wither on the vine. Upon a rickety platform, usually reserved for livestock or the pitiful belongings of the bankrupt, stood Ilara. Dust clung to the hem of her worn calico dress, a testament to a journey she hadn't chosen, a life unraveled by a husband's reckless debts and a death that left her exposed to the raw, unyielding cruelty of the frontier. Beside her, clutching her skirts with tiny, trembling hands, were her children, 6-year-old Thomas, his eyes wide with a terror too big for his small frame, and 4-year-old Lily, whose soft whimpers were swallowed by the coarse murmurs of the assembled crowd. Ilara's face, pale beneath a smattering of freckles, was a mask of stoic endurance, but her gaze, fixed on some distant point beyond the leering faces, held the hunted look of a doe cornered by wolves. The auctioneer, a man named Silas Blackwood, whose belly strained against his stained waistcoat and whose voice boomed with false bonhomie, was extolling her meager virtues, strong back, still young enough for work, and comes with 2 extra hands, though small they be. Laughter, sharp and humorless, rippled through the onlookers. Each word was a lash, each shared glance a stone cast. She was property, a debt to be settled, her humanity stripped away layer by layer under the indifferent sky. The townsfolk, a chorus of hard faces and harder hearts, saw not a mother in peril, but a burden, a reminder of their own precarious existences. They whispered of her late husband's folly, of the shame she bore, their judgment a palpable force that pressed in on Ilara, threatening to crush what little spirit remained. She didn't cry, tears were a luxury she couldn't afford, a weakness she wouldn't show. Instead, she drew her children closer, her slender arms a fragile bastion against the encroaching darkness. The heat shimmered off the dusty ground, mirroring the feverish anxiety in her chest, as Blackwood's voice rose, "Who'll start the bidding for this unfortunate soul, this widow and her encumbrances?" The word hung in the air, heavy and demeaning. This was the precipice, the jagged edge of despair, a public crucifixion of dignity. At the edge of the grim assembly, half hidden in the shade thrown by the sagging porch of the general store, stood Jedediah Stone. He was a man carved from the unforgiving land itself, his face a roadmap of solitary years, his eyes the color of a winter sky, holding a sorrow that rarely flickered into view. A permanent limp, a souvenir from a war long past but never forgotten, kept him slightly apart, a silent observer in a world he no longer felt a part of. He'd come to town for supplies, not for spectacle, but the raw injustice of the scene snagged at something deep within him, something he thought had died years ago with his own wife and child, lost to the prairie fever. He watched Blackwood preen and posture, heard the callous bids begin, low and insulting, each one chipping away at Ilara's stoic facade. He saw the almost imperceptible tremor in her hands as she held her children, the way her jaw tightened. He saw not the encumbrances the auctioneer proclaimed, but 2 terrified innocents, and a woman holding herself together with threads of sheer will. An old anger, cold and sharp, stirred in Jedediah's chest. He knew the cost of loss, the sting of being alone. He had nothing but his isolated ranch, a place of ghosts and hard work, a testament to his own enduring grief. What was one more sorrow, one more burden, in a life already defined by them? The bids crept up, pitifully. Blackwood was trying to incite a rivalry, his greasy smile fixed. Going once, going twice. Jedediah straightened, the movement stiff, deliberate. He pushed himself away from the wall, his shadow falling long and stark as he stepped into the oppressive sunlight. The crowd parted slightly, a ripple of surprise. Jedediah Stone rarely involved himself in town affairs. He walked towards the platform, his limp more pronounced on the uneven ground. He didn't shout. He didn't posture. He simply stated, his voice raspy from disuse but carrying an undeniable weight, $50, a collective gasp. It was more than the woman and her supposed debt were deemed worth by this cruel calculus, it was a sum that spoke of intention, not just acquisition. Blackwood's eyes widened, then narrowed. $50 from Mr. Stone. A generous bid. Do I hear 60? Silence. The crowd stared, first at Jedediah, then at Ilara, who finally looked directly at him, a flicker of disbelief, of raw, untamed hope, in her weary eyes. He met her gaze, held it for a moment, a silent acknowledgement of her plight. He wasn't offering salvation, not yet, he was offering an alternative to this public vivisection. When no other bid came, Jedediah spoke again, his voice cutting through the expectant hush. "That's my offer." For her debt. Not for her. He pulled a worn leather pouch from his belt, counted out the coins with calloused fingers, the clink of silver loud in the sudden stillness. He placed the money on the edge of the platform, a definitive thud. "She's coming with me," or Blackwood, deflated but pragmatic, snatched up the coins. The townsfolk murmured, confused, intrigued. Jedediah Stone, the hermit rancher, buying a widow? He ignored them all, turning to Ilara. He said, the single word rough but not unkind. He offered no hand, just a slight inclination of his head towards his waiting wagon, a silent directive. The journey to Jedediah's ranch was a passage through a landscape as stark and unyielding as the man himself. Ilara sat stiffly on the wagon seat, Thomas and Lily huddled between them, their small faces pale with exhaustion and lingering fear. The sun beat down, the dust rose in choking clouds with every turn of the wheels, and the silence stretched taut, broken only by the creak of the wagon and the jingle of the harness. Jedediah spoke little, pointing out a dry creek bed or a distant butte, his words as sparse as the vegetation. Ilara, still reeling from the sudden shift in her fortune, or perhaps just the exchange of one unknown for another, offered only quiet nods. She watched him, the set of his jaw, the way his hands, weathered and strong, handled the reins with an economy of movement. He was an enigma, this quiet man who had plucked her from the depths of public humiliation. Was he kind, or merely eccentric? A savior, or just another master in a different guise? Fear, a cold serpent, still coiled in her belly. When they finally crested a low rise, the ranch came into view, nestled in a shallow valley. It was not a grand place. The cabin was small, built of rough-hewn logs, its porch sagging slightly on one end. A corral, its fence in need of mending, stood nearby, along with a weathered barn. Wind whistled through the eaves of the outbuildings, a lonely sound. Yet, there was a stark beauty to it, a sense of solitude that, after the suffocating judgment of the town, felt almost like a breath of fresh air. "This is it," Jedediah said, his voice flat. He helped her down, his touch brief and impersonal, then lifted the sleeping children, carrying them gently, one in each arm, towards the cabin. Ilara followed, her heart a confusion of apprehension and a fragile, nascent hope. Inside, the cabin was simple, clean but Spartan. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. There was a rough plank table, 2 chairs, a bed in one corner, and another smaller room off to the side. Jedediah laid the children on the narrow cot in the small room, covering them with a faded quilt. "This will be yours," he said, gesturing to the small room. "It ain't much." Ilara could only nod, words failing her. The ensuing days fell into a quiet rhythm. Ilara, driven by a desperate need to prove her worth, to not be a burden, threw herself into work. She scrubbed the floors until they shone, mended Jedediah's worn shirts with neat, almost invisible stitches, cooked meals from the meager supplies, her stews and breads filling the small cabin with unfamiliar, comforting aromas. She tended the small, neglected vegetable patch she found behind the cabin, coaxing green shoots from the parched earth. She did not ask for anything, did not expect anything beyond this fragile sanctuary. The children, initially timid, began to explore, their laughter, tentative at first, then more confident, a sound the silent ranch hadn't heard in years. Lily would often present Jedediah with a wildflower, her small face earnest, while Thomas, more reserved, would watch him with an unnerving intensity, as if trying to decipher the man's soul. Jedediah observed her tireless efforts with a quiet, unreadable expression. He repaired the leaking roof over her small room without a word, ensuring she and the children stayed dry during a sudden prairie shower. He left a freshly butchered rabbit on the cabin stoop one morning, a silent offering for their stew pot. He noticed Lily's fascination with the whittled figures he sometimes carved by the fire in the evenings, mostly misshapen animals, products of restless hands. One evening, he left a small, surprisingly well-carved wooden bluebird beside her sleeping form on the cot. Ilara found it the next morning, her fingers tracing its smooth contours, a knot tightening in her throat. These small, unspoken kindnesses were more potent than any grand declaration. They were pebbles dropped into the still pool of her fear, sending out ripples of tentative trust. She still worked relentlessly, driven by the ingrained fear of being cast out, but a fraction of the tension in her shoulders eased. The silence between them remained, yet it was no longer solely the silence of strangers, but one that was slowly, painstakingly, being filled with shared space, shared routines, the unspoken understanding of two solitary souls coexisting under the vast, indifferent sky. He fixed the loose step on the porch she often tripped over, planed it smooth. He expanded the vegetable garden for her, turning over the hard soil with his strong arms, never asking, just doing. He even brought back a bolt of soft blue calico from his next trip to town, leaving it on the table with a sack of flour. His only commenter, Gruff, figured the young uns might need something. Ilara's hands trembled as she touched the fabric. It was the color of a summer sky, a promise of something other than drab servitude. She didn't speak of it, but that night, she mended his favorite worn-out work coat with particular care, reinforcing the seams, patching an elbow with a piece of sturdy canvas, her needle flying under the flickering lamplight, a silent thank you woven into every stitch. The ranch, once just a backdrop for his solitude, began to feel different, the air lighter, the shadows less oppressive. The shy laughter of the children, the scent of baking bread, Ilara's quiet, purposeful movements, they were threads of life reweaving the fabric of his desolate existence. He found himself listening for the sound of her humming as she worked, a low, almost melancholic tune, yet it was a sound of presence, of life. He hadn't realized how deeply the silence had settled into his bones until it began, ever so slightly, to recede, pushed back by these small, tenacious signs of another's existence. He was not a man given to introspection, but he recognized the shift, the subtle thawing around the frozen core of his grief. He was still a lonely man, but he was no longer quite so alone. One evening, as the prairie wind moaned around the corners of the cabin and the fire crackled a warm counterpoint, a fragile peace had settled. The children were asleep, tucked into their cot, their breathing soft and even. Ilara was mending a tear in Thomas's small trousers, her head bent, the lamplight catching the auburn glints in her hair. Jedediah sat across from her, ostensibly cleaning his rifle, but his gaze kept drifting to her quiet industry. It was Thomas, in a moment of sleepy bravery earlier that day, who had innocently asked, pointing to Jedediah's leg, "Why do you walk like that, Mr. Stone?" Jedediah had merely grunted then, but the question hung in the air, an unspoken invitation. Now, in the shared quiet, he broke the silence, his voice low. "The war," he said, not looking at her, his hand still on the rifle. "Shrapnel." Some men lost more. Ilara's needle paused. She looked up, her expression carefully neutral, yet her eyes held a new attentiveness. He continued, words coming haltingly, like water from a long dry well. He spoke of the roar of cannons, the fear, the senseless loss. He didn't speak of heroism, but of the bone-deep weariness, the ghosts that walked with him still. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "Lost my wife, Sarah, and our boy, little Jake, to the fever, year after I got back. This place, it was supposed to be a new start." His voice trailed off, the admission costing him more than he would ever say. The silence that followed was different, imbued with a shared understanding of pain. Ilara's own carefully constructed walls seemed to tremble. She set aside her mending, her hands clasped in her lap. "My husband, Arthur," she began, her voice soft, hesitant, "he was not a bad man. Not always. But he had a weakness for cards, for promises of quick fortune that never came." She recounted their early days, filled with hope, the birth of Thomas, then Lily. Then the slow descent into debt, the whispered arguments, the growing desperation in Arthur's eyes. He went hunting one day, seeking game to sell, to make things right. There was an accident. A fall. She paused, swallowing. "The debts, they fell on me. Mr. Blackwood, he held the biggest note. He said I had to pay, one way or another." Her voice broke slightly on the last words, a tremor of the remembered terror. "I was so afraid for Thomas and Lily." What would become of them? She didn't weep, but her eyes glistened in the firelight. Jedediah finally looked at her, truly looked, seeing not just the resilient woman, but the grieving widow, the terrified mother. He saw the echoes of his own losses in her story. He said nothing, but he reached out, his calloused hand briefly covering hers where it rested on the table. It was a gesture of profound, unadorned empathy, a bridge built across the chasm of their individual sorrows. The touch was fleeting, yet it resonated in the small cabin, a silent acknowledgement that they were no longer just two strangers bound by circumstance, but two souls who had glimpsed the hidden wounds of the other. The fragile peace they had begun to build was shattered by the shriek of the wind, a harbinger of the storm that descended upon the plains with sudden, brutal ferocity. What began as a dusting of snow quickly escalated into a blinding blizzard, the flakes driven horizontally, erasing the horizon, transforming the familiar landscape into a swirling white vortex. The cabin, once a haven, now felt like a tiny, besieged outpost. Jedediah fought his way to the barn to secure the livestock, the wind tearing at him, snow stinging his face. Ilara, her own anxieties for their safety mounting, worked to keep the fire roaring, stuffing rags into the cracks in the window frames against the encroaching cold. For 2 days, the storm raged, imprisoning them. The world outside ceased to exist, replaced by the howl of the elements. On the 3rd morning, as the wind began to abate, though the snow still fell heavily, Lily woke with a burning fever. Her small body was racked with shivers, her breath shallow and rapid. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Ilara. This was not a simple cold, this was the swift, deadly sickness that stalked the frontier, the kind that had claimed Jedediah's own child. The nearest doctor was in Redemption Gulch, a journey that was now impossible, the snowdrifts making travel a fool's errand. Despair threatened to engulf her. Jedediah, seeing the child's distress and the terror in Ilara's eyes, felt a grim helplessness. He knew this enemy. He had fought it before and lost. But then, something shifted in Ilara. The fear remained, but it was overlaid with a fierce, maternal resolve. "There are herbs," she murmured, more to herself than to him, her eyes distant, focused inward. "My grandmother, she knew the old ways. She spoke of willow bark for fever, of lungwort for the chest, of plants he'd only ever seen as weeds." Jedediah, a man of practicalities, might have been skeptical, but the desperation in her voice, and the memory of his own Sarah's futile battle, made him listen. "I saw some elder near the creek bed in the fall," she said, her mind racing. "And yarrow. I think I know where it might be sheltered." It was a slim hope, a desperate gamble. "I have to try." Jedediah looked out at the still treacherous landscape, then back at the determined set of her jaw. He saw not a foolish woman grasping at straws, but a mother fighting for her child with the only weapon she possessed. "Show me," he said, his voice gruff. "I'll go," but Ilara shook her head. "No. I know what to look for, how they feel even under the snow. You keep the fire. Keep her warm, bundled against the biting cold." Ilara ventured out into the white wilderness, Jedediah watching from the doorway, his heart a heavy stone in his chest. She moved with a strange certainty, her gloved hand sifting through snow, her gaze scanning the contours of the land. It was as if an unseen map guided her, an ancient knowledge awakening within her. She returned hours later, frost clinging to her eyelashes, her sack containing a meager collection of roots and dried leaves, but her eyes burned with a focused light. While Jedediah maintained a vigil by Lily's cot, Ilara prepared her remedies, crushing herbs, steeping teas, her movements precise, almost ritualistic. She bathed Lily's forehead, coaxed a few drops of bitter liquid between her lips, her touch gentle, her voice a low, soothing murmur. For 2 more days, the battle raged, Lily's life hanging by a thread, Ilara's resilience pitted against the fever's cruel tenacity. Jedediah became her silent partner, keeping the fire stoked, melting snow for water, his presence a steady, grounding force. He witnessed her exhaustion, her unwavering focus, her deep, intuitive connection to the healing earth, and a profound respect bloomed in him, a respect that went beyond gratitude, touching something akin to awe. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tide began to turn. Lily's breathing eased, the terrible heat in her small body lessened. On the 5th day since the storm began, she opened her eyes, her gaze weak but clear, and whispered, "Mama." Ilara wept then, silent tears of exhaustion and overwhelming relief streaming down her face as she cradled her daughter. Jedediah, standing in the doorway of the small room, felt a tightness in his own chest, an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. It was relief, yes, but also a profound admiration for this woman's unyielding spirit. The shared crisis had forged a new, unspoken bond between them, stronger than any words. The snow finally stopped, revealing a world transformed, pristine and silent under a pale sun. As life on the ranch slowly returned to a semblance of normality, a subtle shift occurred. The quiet between Ilara and Jedediah was no longer laced with apprehension but with a shared history, a mutual reliance proven in the crucible of fear. The children, sensing the change, became more open, their laughter echoing more freely. Thomas, who had watched Ilara's tireless efforts with his solemn eyes, began to follow Jedediah around the ranch, mimicking his movements, asking tentative questions about the animals and the land. Lily, her strength returning, would often sit by the fire, watching Ilara, her small face mirroring her mother's quiet determination. But the peace they had found was as fragile as new spring ice. One afternoon, as Jedediah was mending a section of the corral fence, Thomas came running, his face pale with alarm. "Man, Mr. Stone! A man on a horse! He's asking for Mama." Jedediah's blood ran cold. He knew, with a grim certainty, that this was not a friendly visitor. He straightened, his hand instinctively going to the axe handle leaning against the fence post. Striding towards the cabin, he saw him, Silas Blackwood, the auctioneer, his bulk overflowing his saddle, a smug, possessive look on his face as he dismounted heavily near the porch where Ilara had frozen, her hand flying to her throat. "Well now, Ilara," Blackwood boomed, his voice dripping with false congeniality that didn't quite mask the menace beneath. "Found you at last. Figured you wouldn't stray too far. This rustic charm can't hold a candle to what I can offer," he leered, his gaze sweeping over her in a way that made Jedediah's fists clench. "Seems that $50 was just a down payment. I've had a better offer for your services. And the brats, well, there's always a need for cheap labor somewhere." Ilara stood her ground, her chin high, though Jedediah could see the tremor in her hands. "I am not for sale, Mr. Blackwood. My debt was paid." Blackwood chuckled, a harsh, grating sound. "Debts have a way of growing, my dear. Interest, you see. And a verbal agreement with Mr. Stone here hardly constitutes a legal transfer of assets." Jedediah stepped forward then, placing himself between Blackwood and Ilara. The old reluctance to violence, born from the horrors of war and the subsequent years of chosen solitude, warred with a new, fierce protectiveness. He had built walls around his heart to keep the pain out, but this woman and her children had, without trying, found the cracks. He remembered the feeling of utter helplessness when his own family was taken from him by sickness, a foe he couldn't fight. But Blackwood, this cruel, grasping man, he could fight. "She's not going anywhere, Blackwood," Jedediah said, his voice a low growl, the quiet authority in it more potent than any shout. "This is her home now," Blackwood sneered. "Playing the hero, Stone? This woman is mine by rights of debt. I have papers." He patted a breast pocket. "Or perhaps you'd like to make another, more substantial, offer? Though I doubt a dirt-poor rancher like you could match it." The air crackled with tension. Ilara's eyes were fixed on Jedediah, not with fear but with a dawning, fierce belief. She had seen his quiet strength, his hidden kindness. She had seen him vulnerable. Now, she saw the protector emerge, the man willing to stand against the darkness for them. The choice was stark for Jedediah: retreat into the familiar shadows of his past, avoid the confrontation his soul craved to escape, or stand and fight for this fragile new life, this tentative hope that had taken root in the barren soil of his existence. The faces of Thomas and Lily, peeking fearfully from behind Ilara's skirts, solidified his resolve. He would not let their world be shattered again. He had lost too much to stand by and watch another's devastation. This was not just about Ilara, it was about reclaiming a part of himself he thought long dead, the part that knew how to defend, to cherish, to fight for what mattered. "The only paper that matters here, Blackwood," Jedediah said, his voice hardening, "is the one that says you'll be trespassing if you don't get back on your horse and ride out." Now he took another step forward, his limp barely noticeable, his stance that of a man rooted to the earth, unmovable. Blackwood's eyes narrowed, assessing. He was a bully, used to intimidation, not to quiet, unyielding resistance. He glanced from Jedediah's resolute face to the cold resolve in Ilara's eyes, and then to the axe handle still visible near the corral. He was outnumbered in spirit, if not in perceived power. Blackwood, for all his bluster, was a coward at heart. He saw the shift in Jedediah, the cold fire in his eyes, a dangerous stillness that promised not negotiation, but retribution. He had expected a cowering woman and a reluctant homesteader, not this united front. His gaze flickered towards the axe again, then back to Jedediah's unwavering stare. "You'll regret this, Stone," he blustered, but the threat lacked conviction. "There are laws. People will hear about this." Jedediah remained silent, his stillness more intimidating than any outburst. After a moment of tense silence, Blackwood seemed to deflate. With a muttered curse, he heaved himself back onto his horse, his face flushed with anger and thwarted greed. "This ain't over," he spat, yanking on the reins, but he turned his horse and rode away, a retreating storm of dust and resentment. They watched him go until he was a small speck on the horizon. The silence he left behind was profound, filled with the echoes of unspoken emotions. Ilara slowly let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her shoulders slumping slightly. Thomas and Lily crept out from behind her, their eyes wide. Jedediah turned, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then, a faint, almost imperceptible softening around his mouth. He looked at Ilara, truly looked at her, seeing not the indebted widow or the resilient worker, but the woman who had brought life back to his desolate ranch, who had shown him what courage looked like, who had faced down her own demons and his. He walked towards the cabin, retrieved something from a small, dusty wooden box he kept on the mantelpiece. He returned to her, his calloused hand opening to reveal a small, intricately carved wooden meadowlark, its wings slightly spread as if in midsong. It was old, the wood worn smooth with time. "My Sarah," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "she loved meadowlarks. Said their song was the sound of hope." He pressed it gently into Ilara's hand. "This ain't a claim, Ilara. It's a choice. This place, it can be your home." Their home, his gaze included the children. "If you'll choose it. If you'll choose to stay with me." He didn't speak of love, not in grand pronouncements. He spoke of choosing, of belonging, of a shared future built not on obligation, but on mutual respect and a slowly dawning affection. Ilara's fingers closed around the meadowlark, its delicate form a tangible symbol of the sanctuary he offered. Tears welled in her eyes, not tears of sorrow or fear this time, but of profound, overwhelming gratitude and a burgeoning, tender love. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick. "Yes, Jedediah. We choose this. We choose you." A small, genuine smile finally touched Jedediah's lips, chasing away years of shadow. He reached out, not to take the bird, but to gently take her hand, the wooden meadowlark nestled between their palms, a silent promise of new beginnings. Years passed, seasons turned, and the isolated ranch in the shallow valley transformed. The cabin, once dark, now had cheerful curtains in the windows, sewn by Ilara from that bolt of blue calico. A sturdy porch swing, built by Jedediah, graced the expanded front porch, often occupied by him and Ilara in the quiet evenings, watching Thomas and Lily, now lanky and confident, chase fireflies in the twilight. The neglected vegetable patch had blossomed into a bountiful garden, its vibrant colors a testament to Ilara's patient hands. Wildflowers, transplanted from the prairie, bloomed in profusion around the house, their cheerful faces nodding in the gentle breeze. The air, once heavy with solitude and unspoken grief, now vibrated with the sounds of a family, laughter, the murmur of lessons as Ilara taught her children and, eventually, a few others from distant homesteads, sharing her knowledge of letters and numbers alongside her intuitive wisdom of herbs and healing. The ranch itself was no longer just for Jedediah Stone's place. They had talked about it one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of rose and gold. Ilara, tracing the outline of the meadowlark Jedediah had given her, which now sat on their shared windowsill, suggested a new name. Meadowlark Creek Ranch, she'd said softly, and Jedediah had nodded, a quiet agreement passing between them. The name stuck. The townsfolk of Redemption Gulch, who had once scorned Elara and pitied Jedediah, slowly began to change their tune. News of her healing skills had trickled out, carried by grateful parents whose children she had nursed through fevers, or by ranch hands whose injuries she had tended with surprising efficacy. They saw the transformation in Jedediah, the harsh lines around his eyes softened, the perpetual winter in his gaze thawed by an inner warmth. They saw Elara, no longer the widow sold for debt, but a woman of quiet strength, wisdom, and an almost ethereal grace, her presence a blessing to the once barren ranch. Respect replaced scorn, admiration replaced judgment. They had not just survived, they had thrived, building a sanctuary of love and resilience from the ashes of their pasts. Jedediah and Elara never had a formal wedding, no preacher to sanctify their union. Their commitment was woven into the fabric of their daily lives, in shared glances across the dinner table, in hands clasped during evening walks, in the quiet comfort of knowing they faced the world together. He had chosen her, not as property, but as a partner, and she had chosen him, recognizing the profound goodness beneath his stoic shell. They had healed each other, their broken pieces fitting together to create something whole and beautiful. The lonely rancher had found his heart again, and the resilient outcast had found her home, her voice, and her truest love, nestled in a valley where meadowlarks sang of enduring hope. Their story became a quiet legend, a testament to the enduring power of compassion and the unexpected paths to redemption. If this story of how a moment of courage and an offering of kindness can transform lives, how even the deepest wounds can heal when met with unwavering love and acceptance, has resonated with your spirit, please show your support. Like this video, share its message of hope with those who might need to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more tales that illuminate the enduring strength of the human heart and the beautiful, unexpected ways we find our way back to each other.